All right, by this point, we've learned about anatomy, the terms that we use to describe motion, and we've learned about qualitative biomechanics, so how to properly observe and evaluate motion. Now, this week, we're making our way towards quantitative biomechanics. But before we jump into numbers and analyzing data, we need to understand how to collect those data. So this week's lecture videos focus on motion capture, specifically from measurement tools, not just from our own eyes, like in qualitative biomechanics. So by the end of this lecture video, we will learn an introduction to kinematics and kinetics and what those terms mean. We'll learn about measurement tools and some common issues associated with these tools. So remember during the introduction lecture or the video, I said that biomechanics was partially defined by mechanics, which is the analysis of forces and their effects. Now, a more complete definition may be that mechanics is the science concerned with the effects of forces specifically acting on objects. So mechanics can be divided into several branches, as we can see here. But rigid body mechanics is best suited for describing and explaining the general or the overall movements of humans and different equipment in sports and exercise. So this is the focus of mechanics for us as biomechanists and as kinesiologists. Specifically in rigid body mechanics, the objects being investigated are assumed to be perfectly rigid. So they don't deform by bending or stretching or compressing. And in describing and explaining the human movements and any implements or equipment in sport and exercise, we'll consider the segments of the human body as these rigid bodies that are linked together at the joints. Now, realistically, the segments of the body do deform a little bit under the actions of forces, but these deformations are usually quite small and don't affect the general movements of the limbs or the body itself. So rigid body mechanics is subdivided into statics, which is the mechanics of objects at rest or moving at a constant velocity, and then dynamics, which is the mechanics of objects in an accelerated motion. Now, dynamics is further subdivided into kinematics and kinetics. So kinematics deals with the description of the motion, whereas kinetics deals with the forces that cause or that tend to cause these changes in motion. So remember, as a first starting point, kinematics is the description of the motion, and kinetics is the forces that cause the motion. So as we saw in last week's videos, there are two different ways to analyze movement. We learned how to qualitatively analyze movements, and now we'll learn how to quantitatively analyze. In order to quantitatively analyze something, we need numbers. So this means we need to actually measure movement using tools, because simply looking at someone move, as we do in qualitative biomechanics, it won't actually give us any numbers. So there's quite a range of tools available for measuring biomechanical variables. And we'll discuss a few tools that we have in our lab upstairs that grad students like myself use frequently to conduct our research experiments. And by upstairs, I mean in our lab in the kin building. So hopefully you have a chance to visit that at some point in your undergrad. Okay, so first we'll talk about tools for measuring kinematic variables. So remember that kinematic just simply means the outcome or the description of the motion. And then we'll talk about tools for measuring kinetics, which are variables that involve forces. So first we have timing devices. Time is a fundamental dimension in mechanics, so the measurement of time is important. And watches are the simplest devices for measuring time. If you require more accuracy, like if you're timing someone during a race, then you could use something like an automatic timing device that might be more appropriate for your goal. If we want to measure something like instantaneous velocity, so not just time, then we need velocity measuring systems. Radar guns can be used to capture the instantaneous velocity of objects in sport. So there are also laser-based velocity measuring devices that'll measure the velocity of specific objects of interest. So it makes it a more accurate tool for measuring the speed of athletes where more than one athlete is at play, or there's more than one object in that same plane of motion. But these tools specifically measure velocity at a specific point in time. So we talked about pictures and videos in qualitative biomechanical analyses. These are essentially optical imaging systems. Video cameras provide these sort of sequential two-dimensional images of movement at specific time intervals depending on the speed of the camera. So in a single recorded image, the position of the body and its parts can be measured relative to each other or to a fixed reference in that field of view. And the positions of body parts in pictures is essentially the coordinates that we learned during the first week. So I don't know if you remember my very great artwork with the stick figure and we located the position of the hip in the coordinate system. Well, that could be obtained through pictures and still frames of videos by means of a process called digitization. And we'll learn about digitization in the next lecture video. Okay, so an accelerometer is a device for measuring accelerations. Makes sense? Accelerometers attached to the object or the person, they measure the acceleration of the object or the person at the point where they're attached. So devices that track the number of steps that you take in a day, those are essentially accelerometers, whether you wear them on your wrist because they're part of your watch, or if you remember, or maybe I'm just too old, but in cereal boxes, we used to get these little pedometers and you would just clip it on your hip and it would measure the number of steps you're taking. That's essentially an accelerometer that's measuring the acceleration at your hip. Another example is a Fitbit. So the Fitbit is equipped with an accelerometer, and that's what allows it to track things like the number of steps taken, the distance traveled, the number of floors climbed, etc. That all comes from an accelerometer. So this is maybe a little less applicable to biomechanics, but it was too cute not to share. An extension of the Fitbit is called the FitBark. And it actually monitors your dog's everyday activity and sleep and turns that into bark points so you can track your dog's progress. Okay, next we have inertial measurement units, or IMUs for short, and they use this little tiny accelerometer and a gyroscope to provide kinematic measurements. So they measure changes in position relative to this initial reference or starting position. And most smartphones and interactive video games like the Nintendo Wii, they have these IMUs that are built in, which is how they're able to detect your position. One example is this IMU that's made by a company called XIO, and this is the unit that you'd wear on your body here. And then this is the important piece of that unit that contains the accelerometer, the gyroscope, and a magnetometer. Now, note the dimensions here in millimeters and the weight of only 49 grams. So these IMU units are tiny, and they're $468 if you're interested. Another example is a kit from Xsense Technology, and that kit comes with 6 inertial measurement units, so you can place them on different regions of your body. Like here, there's an IMU on the hand, the wrist, and the upper arm. But again, the technology here is the same. This little tiny chip made of an accelerometer and a gyroscope gives you the kinematic information of the movement. Now, this system costs a lot more money. It costs $11,000. But you really don't need anything fancy. If you have a smartphone, odds are you have the capability of collecting the same data that these fancier IMUs collect, because your smartphone is already equipped with an accelerometer and a gyroscope. So you just need an app that will give you the data. So these are just examples of different apps that you can download that would essentially give you the same information as an IMU would. The last tool that's used to collect kinematic data is a motion capture system. Now, these systems are used to capture in digital form the three-dimensional movements of the whole body. So components of a motion capture system usually include about 6 or more video cameras, just so that you can have different angles of the movement. As we've learned, you want to be always perpendicular to the plane of action. So 6 or more video cameras, a marker system, and a specialized software or hardware to produce the digital representation of the movement. And the idea here is that the body is modeled as a system of rigid links that are connected at the joints. And marker sets are attached to each body segment to identify the location and the orientation of each segment in 3 dimensions. So when I talk about marker sets here, I'm referring to these little dots that are placed in specific parts on the person's body. So here's an example of the motion capture system that we have in the lab. And this was from my master's thesis research. So on the left, you see the participant who's wearing a bunch of those little markers all over their body and specifically on their legs. And then on the right, you see what the camera system sees. So the camera system only picks up those little markers. And then I connected the dots with these rigid lines here to just visually show the different segments. So those are all the tools to measure kinematics of motion. Now let's move on to the kinetics. As we know, kinetic variables are based on forces, and forces are the cause of change in motion. And the most popular devices for measuring kinetic variables are force platforms or force plates. And these measure reaction forces at the point of application. And then they also give you the direction of the resultant reaction force. So in the lab, we have these force platforms that are embedded in the ground. And so they measure forces every time you step or jump on them. They measure the ground reaction force right at that point of application. So these force plates or force platforms are commonly used in gait or walking studies. Also in jumping studies or anything where you're looking to measure the ground reaction force, or another word for that is the normal force, and then the force of friction, either in the anterior or posterior direction or in the mediolateral direction. I know you're not familiar with these different terms yet, so we will be focusing a lot more on forces in a few weeks, but I just wanted to give you the gist of it now so that you can understand what measurement tool we used for forces. So another type of force transducer is a strain gauge. And strain gauges measure strain, and strain is a change in length divided by the original length of the object. So strain gauge force transducers have been used to measure, for example, forces on the rings and the horizontal bars in gymnastics and on the start handle in the luge. So they're more popular, if you will, on the equipment in sports, not so much on the human body itself, although that is still possible. Pressure sensors are these little thin mats with a bunch of force sensors that are embedded in them. So while a force plate measures just this resultant reaction force, pressure sensors better represent the distributed nature of the force. So like force plates, pressure mats are often used in gait or walking research, but there are also these insole pressure measuring systems that are used to design more effective orthotics and shoes. And in sports, pressure measuring insoles have been used to measure the pressure that's exerted by a skier's foot in the boot. The last tool that we're going to talk about is electromyography. So this tool, which is also known as EMG, it indirectly measures muscle forces produced during a movement. So EMG measures the electrical activity of a contracting muscle, either via surface electrodes, like you see here, these two little black gadgets here, those are EMG sensors. Or a more invasive way to do this is to actually have these indwelling electrodes that are implanted in the muscle itself. But both of these are part of electromyography, which measures muscle activity. Okay, so the instrument that's used to measure the movement and the setting that it's used in may affect the performance of the athlete, the patient, the client, whoever you're analyzing. So ideally, the environment in which you measure the performance should be carefully controlled if that's possible. Most data for quantitative biomechanical analyses are collected in a biomechanics lab where the environment can be controlled. So that's nice. But the drawback is that a biomechanics lab is not the setting in which the athlete or the patient normally moves or performs. So the lab should be set up to duplicate as closely as possible the environment in which the movement would normally occur. Now, on the other hand, the benefit of having these lab-based data collections is your ability to control the environment. So things like cameras, lights, temperature, those are always the same and controllable in a lab setting. But an actual competition may be the best environment for measuring the biomechanics of an athlete's performance because that's where they would normally perform the movement. However, the competition setting may not be the best setting for biomechanics. The major drawback of collecting during an athletic competition is the lack of control over the environment. So the biomechanist has no control over the performer or the factors that could influence the performance. Also, most biomechanics tools are not very portable, as you can imagine. To record ground reaction forces, which are used for kinetics, force plates would have to be mounted in the competition setting. So that's obviously not ideal. But it is possible. So here we have an IMU, so made up of an accelerometer and a gyroscope, that's actually embedded in the baseball. So in this case, we would be able to analyze the pitcher, for example, during a game or during a practice where we collect data within this ball without them having to compromise the environment that they would usually perform in. Okay, so in this video, we got a glimpse of kinematics and kinetics, which are terms that you'll be super familiar with by the end of this course. We also learned about a bunch of different measurement tools that are used in biomechanics, and we touched on a few common measurement issues with measuring in the lab versus in the field.